All right, so it's 1 o'clock here on the East Coast. My name is Paul Merrill. I'm from Beaufort Fairmont Automated Testing Services, and I want to get started on this webinar today talking about accelerating delivery of quality software in test automation. A couple of things before we get started, or as we're getting started. I'm hoping that you can see my main slide right now. If there's ever any problem with that as we're going along, let me know. You can type into this console that GoToWebinar pulls up. Either type a question or something in the chat, or find another way to let me know. You can always raise your hand and I will try to get to your thoughts with that. You ought to be able to see my face right now as well. Hopefully the webcam is on. I got some positive feedback about that earlier, at least positive about the fact that it was on, maybe not about the what they were seeing, but anyway, it's nice to have you all here. I'm glad you're here today. I'm looking forward to this particular webinar. I was just touching it up as we were going along as I was getting prepared for this. Once again, my name is Paul Merrill. What we do at Beaufort Fairmont is we focus on test automation. And what that means is we help teams with things like syncing up testing and development within agile environments. We help teams with things like automating regression testing. And we do that 3 different ways. One is through consulting, one is through training, and one is through project work. We eat, sleep, live, and breathe this stuff, and we like working with teams to learn more about test automation and to get them ready to move forward with their own initiatives. So let's get started. Let's talk about this. My Twitter handle is here. Please make sure to tweet as we're going along if you see something that's interesting. You can also get in contact with me through that, Paul Merrill. So let's get going here. You'll also see me as we go along kind of looking off to the right, which is where I have the control panel for GoToWebinar. So if you see that, that's why that's happening. So one of the main things that I wanted to talk about in this was the way that testing right now by many is considered a bottleneck. And what I didn't realize when I put out the notification for this webinar is the response that I would get about the name or the word bottleneck. I really thought that while it maybe had a little bit of a negative connotation, it's not an extremely negative one, but the reaction I got was very different. It was actually, it seems like people have very deep emotions about this word. And I think that it's worth investigating when that's the case. So one person in particular made very sure and made very clear to ask me where I got my references about bottlenecks and testing being perceived as bottlenecks. So we're going to get into that first. Let's talk about the problem. So I read a lot of these papers. One of the recent papers that I read was DevOps Review from 2017 from Computing Research. And in there they talk about the main holdups in software production process, the bottlenecks, as they call them. And as you can see from this chart, from their surveys, 63%, by far the most, almost double the second most responses, was about testing and QA. Second thing I wanted to show you was a piece from World Quality Report from 2016 and 2017, which Hewlett-Packard Enterprise and several other companies put together each year. And they have lots of good information about what's going on in the industry. They survey all of their clients, and they survey lots of other folks in the testing industry as well. They talk to different levels of people within the organization. They talk to executives, they talk to managers, they talk about to all different types of people. But one of the things they mentioned here is that a lack of a good testing approach that fits with the agile development method is cited by 43% of respondents this year, up from 29% in 2015. So the data was coming from 2016. This is the latest that I have available. This reflects a shift in behavior where testing is being viewed as the biggest bottleneck in the delivery of agile projects. So for the person who wanted citations, here it is, World Quality Report 16 and 17. The bottleneck, let's get into this a little bit more. This is from the same report. They talk about our research clearly shows that despite the continued adoption of agile methods and methodologies, challenges within quality and testing in agile projects are increasing. So this is their survey that's showing this, and I think it's well worth our time to investigate what's going on here. Is my screen share okay? I've got a note here that says my screen share looks frozen. I hope that you all can see what I just repeated there, this comment about our research clearly shows. If you can't see that, please let me know. I'd love to hear if you can see that. John, if it's okay now, please let me know. Slides never changed. Okay, all right. Give me 1 second here. I appreciate your feedback. Let me see if I can get this fixed. Hopefully you can still see me, and going back. All right, so let's see. Do you see the graph, the chart? Thank you so much for all of your feedback. I see a lot of folks who said they can't see it. It looks like we still can't see it. Okay. Same slide you were on. So can you slide never change, only white screen? Well, this is disappointing. Let me see what I can do here. I'm going to try to stop sharing my screen and maybe start again, and maybe that will help. Let's see if this helps. So hopefully right now, let's see what you can see right now. Has it changed at all? I appreciate all your feedback. I'm sorry that this is a problem. So I see that's better. Yes, that worked for me. Okay, so hopefully you're looking at the one that says the bottleneck, and I'm going to go back a couple slides since apparently we missed those. Thank you so much for all your feedback and your help on that. So let's go back. Starting slide, you saw the bottleneck is the problem here. This is the graph, the chart that I was talking about that you couldn't see at the time. 63% of respondents, 63% by far, everyone was saying the same thing. So many people were saying the same thing. The bottleneck, we go on to learn a lack of good testing approach that fits with the agile development method is cited by 43% of respondents, up from 29% last year. That's a big shift. That's a huge shift. 23% higher in 2016 than 2017. The bottleneck, our research clearly shows that despite the continued adoption of agile methodologies, challenges with quality and testing in agile projects are increasing. That's a problem. That's a problem because we were supposed to get benefits out of agile. We were supposed to get some good things from agile. So if we're still experiencing these problems after 17 years or more of doing agile development, something's wrong. Another statement of the bottleneck with regard to testing and the way that people feel about testing and the way that they experience testing comes from Forbes. So this is straight out of a Forbes article called the 11 Common DevOps Bottlenecks. And they say, if testing is performed manually, it is impossible to implement continuous integration and continuous delivery in an agile manner, if at all. Also, manual testing increases the chance of producing defects, creating unplanned work. When deployments are performed fully or partially manual, the risk of deployment failure increases significantly, which lowers quality and reliability and increases unplanned work. This is a problem. We can't have manual interactions if we're going to move fast at high quality within our software development projects. So what's going on? So that's part of what I want to talk about here. You know, if we don't talk about the reality of the situation, there's no chance we're going to make it any better. So traditionally, folks took the model that they had from the Industrial Revolution and applied it to software. We were producing things. We had basically a manufacturing line where developers were on one side and they would work on constructing a product and work on constructing a product. And when it got to the end of the line, we would have testers inspect it and decide, is this what we meant to create? The problem with that is that it's not manufacturing. It's something much more difficult. And we found out very quickly this is a lie. So we found out very quickly at the beginning of software engineering and the history of software engineering, and as early as the 80s, we started realizing there was a serious problem with the way that we were doing this. And the problem was basically that software doesn't work like a physical product. If you get to the end of the line and a tester says, hey, there's something wrong with this, you can always take that same product and send it back to the beginning of the line or back to one part in the line and have it changed and fixed and move forward. In fact, we're not producing millions of products. We're not producing hundreds of products or instances of products. We're producing one thing. It's one idea. It's more like a blueprint. And when you produce blueprint, you don't do it at a manufacturing line. You collaborate around it. You surround it and work together on it. And this is more of what we do in software. So we found very quickly that this old model, that this traditional manufacturing type model did not work very well for most software development. Now, traditional methodologies within software, if you're following me here, they can work. It's not that they don't work ever, it's that sometimes they do, and maybe there's a better way. And in fact, if we begin to explore how we create this intellectual property as opposed to how we create products, there's a lot that can be learned. And that's kind of where the agile mindset came from, and a lot of it came from. So here's the reality of what was really happening in a lot of those cases. And hopefully you're laughing right now and have experienced this, because I've experienced it a lot of times. What would really happen is we would do development for a while and we'd find out, oh, we may not hit our date. We're kind of going to miss delivering on the date when we thought that testing should start happening, on the date that a product would be available for test. And so the actual date was much, much longer, much later in the process than we thought. So development got extended, testing got squeezed because we still have a date to meet in most cases. So this is kind of where things went and where they are for lots of companies right now. And Agile can help with a part of that, but I see this reduced many times into a smaller set of time that we call a sprint. Many times we do the very same things in our Agile sprints or iterations that we were doing in a traditional software development environment. So I want to take a quick break right here, and I want to ask a poll. So here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to pull up this poll, and I want your thoughts on this. And it's always interesting to me to see people's thoughts on these things. So I'm launching this poll. The poll is, what do testers do? I want to hear your thoughts on this. I only allow you to vote on one. Hopefully you can see the poll right now and you're voting. And I've got 4 options there. One is identify and communicate the state of the product. Testers do nothing, that's an option. They break software is another option, or they slow down software delivery. And it looks like we've got some people collecting around the idea of identifying and communicating the state of software, which is good. It sounds like maybe we have an educated, a group of people who've done some testing and have experienced testing over time. I'm going to close the poll here, and hopefully you can see my slides again. If you can't, put something into the questions or chat. 83% say it's identifying and communicating the state of the product. And I think there's probably more that we do there. I know that some people think of testing as breaking software, and the fact is that we as testers rarely break software. What we do is we expose things that are already broken, and then we message them. And so I think a lot of times, there's the idea out there that, shoot the messenger. And I think that that's a real thing, that many times we as testers get an unfair negative light cast against us because we're messaging out problems with the system. We're not the ones who broke it. It was broken before it got to us. We just exposed that it was broken most of the time. So we're identifying what those things are. We identify differences between what we expect and what we actually see happening. We communicate those to people who matter appropriately at the appropriate time, and hopefully we can help identify risk of that sometimes as well. So I'm glad that you can see that you have similar mindset to me. And so what happens when we have testing being a small part of the process at the end is that we're not identifying as often and as early as we could potentially be. I think that this is a learned behavior. Being able to test continuously is a learned behavior for teams. It's a learned behavior for the leaders of those teams, and it's something that we work very closely with our clients here at Beaufort Fairmont. So this brings us back to the idea of test automation. How are we going to speed things up? And you talk to executives and they're all going to say the same thing. Well, we got to get test automation going. They know that there is a savings there. Many of us think that there is an efficiency, a value to be gained by introducing test automation into our environments and into our process. And it very well can. I think that many times we see this vision where we've got lots and lots of bots or scripts or whatever they are running against many, many, many different applications or systems or devices. And this is where we're going to get our bang for the buck, and that's absolutely true. We can get there. The problem with this, as I've discussed in other webinars that you can go find on beaufortfairmont.com/webinars, is that this takes a while to get there. Generally, we underestimate the resources that we need to do this. We underestimate, and by resources I don't mean people, I mean a collection of our investment of time, money, and people. We underestimate those things. We underestimate the ability to do it because it's just testing after all, right? It's just scripting up some tests. So I think we underestimate the challenge at hand. And if you think about that, if you think about what test automation actually is, it is a thing that we are entrusting. It is code that we are entrusting to do the work of a tester. It's code that we're entrusting to ensure that code that we're giving to our customers works correctly. So it needs to be as good or better quality than the code that we're putting out to our customers and clients. So that takes us back to who's going to do it, right? So are we actually thinking that we're going to take testers who have never written code before or who self-selected into testing because they didn't want to write code and teach them or force them to write code for test automation? That's going to be better than what our developers do? That's not usually the case, but that's something that so many folks want to do. So let's talk about the process and the way that people see this. I think that this vision of test automation and what people see is that instead of having development move on for a while and then having testing come in, we're going to have development work going on, we're going to do the automation, and then boom, time saved, just like that. And I see some problems with this slide. Number one, what happened to testing? Number two, why do we believe that automation can happen in less time than development to begin with? And number three, if we're not going to have people with development skills doing the automation, and like on this slide, we don't have testing listed here, so I'm assuming all the testers are doing the automation. How is that going to take less time? How are we going to start out doing test automation in less time? So once again, boom, this is a lie. All right. I have not seen this happen in the beginning of automation sprints, and I have not seen this happen in the sense of testing going away. I haven't seen this happen in terms of putting less people and time into development processes or projects. In fact, I see more time and effort going into test automation than it did prior to test automation. More people involved, more work involved, more effort involved when we do test automation projects. The reason that it helps is that we're able eventually to cover more reliably, to report more reliably, to run it more often, to get a better understanding of the state of the product continuously over time. So these are the things that automation can help with. But sometimes our investment, the idea of what we're going to invest, in fact, I find this with lots of different folks. We believe that we can invest this much to get this giant return. And if the return is as high as we think it is, and it can be extremely high, then what's the problem with investing more? We're still going to pay off the resources that we put into it. So the argument there is pretty clear for me. Here's what I want to do. I'm going to take a quick break, and I want to ask you some questions and see if you have questions. So start typing those in. I know that it takes a minute or two to formulate a question when you have a break like this, to think through what it is you want to ask. If you want me to go back to another slide and talk through it, or to give you a different idea about something, please let me know. Do you believe that this is a lie? Do you think that testing as a craft can be taken out of the process? What are your thoughts on this? And also tell me about what testers do. Do you believe that that this implication I've made here, that testing is something other than breaking software, and that is something that is actually valuable? Tell me about your thoughts and feelings about that. So I'm just trying to delay while we're waiting for a few questions here. And I'm okay if we don't have any questions too, that's fine. I appreciate everybody being here. I see some familiar names. I see Tom and Sherry and Randy and some other folks that join us from time to time. Laura, I appreciate everybody being here, and all the new folks too. Heath is on here. You know, I wanted to take this kind of up a level to a little bit higher level of maybe management and the process level with this particular webinar. I'm going to dive back down into some more detailed technical stuff next month. We do this every single month, and all the recordings are out on the website. I don't see any questions here, so I'm going to move on. So most automation efforts, when I go in and work with clients, what I see is this is what's happening when we first attempt to do test automation. That the reality of the situation is that we do some development, but we end up spending much more time to do the same amount of work. So we used to just do development and testing, and somehow we would manage to get it all done, but we end up spending more time because we want to automate testing, because we end up doing more testing, because we found more issues, because we usually take people off of the testing team to do the test automation, so it takes us a longer amount of time to do that testing. So this is what I see more often. So the question becomes, how can we help? How can we use test automation to help break this bottleneck? And what can we do in order to help test automation work and to provide the benefits that we expect? So let's talk about breaking the bottleneck. So a big problem that I see, or something that I see very often, is I see testing in organizations as not being a first-class citizen. And what I mean by that is I see lots of cases where the power dynamic within the organization is that even though we're all individual contributors, developers, testers, test automation engineers, DevOps, operations, networking, whoever, system admins, even though we're all individual contributors, many times I see this classification where developers are somehow above testers. And I hear it in our language. I hear it in the way that we talk. I hear us talk about things like oh, he fell out of development and he's in testing now, or how did you fall into testing? It's a part of our language that's so embedded into the way that we think that we don't even recognize it anymore. How often do you hear a developer saying, we don't have to test that, to a tester? Now, who should be the expert on what we test? The person who constructed the code, or the person who's testing the code? The person who spent their entire career learning how to test and making a craft of that. We don't have to test that. Well, maybe the question wasn't about whether or not you believe we should test that. Maybe the question was more about what is it we need to test and exploring that. Maybe people weren't coming to development for an answer sometimes, but more to learn more about what's going on and to explore questions together. So a lot of times I see developer, tester, and until we can get face-to-face, testers aren't able, and side-by-side and shoulder-by-shoulder and at the same level, peer-to-peer, until we get to that point, testers are not as able to do their job, because what we need is to have an open academic dialogue. We need to be able to say, look, I believe the software should do this. I see the software doing that. Can you help me understand what's going on? And then the developer can say, you know, what it is they believe it was supposed to do, or the way that they understood the requirements, or the problems with implementing it that way, or whatever. But we have to be able to challenge each other, and testers have to be able to challenge programmers. Testers are not subservient to developers. We're on the same team. We have the same goals. We're all working toward the same outcome, which is producing the right quality product for our customers. Implementing sensible test automation, I think this is something that happens again and again. I see this a ton, which is I see things like, hey, we've got this huge regression suite. How do we automate it? Well, many times that's not sensible. Many times that's not helpful to anyone. I see so often companies that have 1,000, 2,000, 10,000 test cases, and those test cases were built through scripting. Scripting that happened either after a product had been built and had not yet changed but would change, scripting that happened before the product was built, where the writers had not seen the product yet. We spend a lot of time writing these test scripts, and in some organizations that makes sense. But once we write them, and we write them as a human, we don't necessarily have to implement them with test automation the same way that we would as humans. Humans value our time. We don't want to sit down and test every single field in a particular web page and go out of the application and come back in and go through the same navigation steps every single time for each field in a page. We want to test it all while we're on the same page, but there may be value in test automation breaking that up. So create sensible test automation. Sometimes that sensible part of this means something other than UI testing. I think so often we default to UI testing because it's easier to see, it's more natural for testers, it makes a lot of sense to us as humans. Our executives can see it, our managers can see it and know what's going on. It's the user interface that we're most familiar with. But we don't necessarily have to interact with the application through a UI. We can interact with it through code, we can interact with it through APIs, we can interact with it to see what it's doing with the database, to see what happens with the scheduled process that pulls inputs out of the database and puts results back in there. There are lots of different entry and exit points for applications. And when we start thinking about what's the minimum amount that I can do to validate one particular part of the application, it can make our job much, much easier with regard to test automation. And I've talked about that many times over. I've got one of my webinars out there is called Syncing Up Testing and Dev and Agile from the Inside Out. So if you haven't seen that, make sure to check that out on the webinars page. Continuous integration. Use it. I've been doing a continuous integration since 2002, and you know, this is another thing that I have webinars out there about. It's not new. Continuous integration is not new. It may be new to you, but it's not new. It can absolutely encourage testing. It can encourage very high quality pieces of software. Testers are not going to lose their jobs just because we're implementing test automation and continuous integration. There's actually more for testers to do because we have more information about the system under test and we get it more often. So there are more questions we can ask once we get the base level of test automation down, and that just keeps on. We never answer all the questions about the product under test. We just never do. It never finishes. So your job is going to be there if it's provided it's valued by those around you. Your job is going to be there, and it's going to be there somewhere for quite a long time, I believe. So the other part of this is implementing a process. So what are the processes we can implement with test automation, or to do test automation in a way that gets rid of this bottleneck? How do we make this process faster? And you know, the answer that comes out of the agile mindset is develop less, more often, smaller chunks. And this solves a whole lot of problems, and I've talked about them time and time again, but the idea that with smaller chunks, the developer is more likely to remember what they were working on and be able to go back and fix it more quickly. The fact that less people would have been able to modify that particular chunk of code over time if you can find the problem with the test early enough. Shifting testing to the left, making sure that we can do these things early and often is a huge help. So smaller chunks with development, smaller chunks with our features, vertical slicing, narrow vertical slices is a huge part of this and one way to help. Testing first and not last, and then testing continuously. That's huge. There are processes out there to learn how to do this. You don't have to try to figure it out on your own. You can go read a book. You can find it on the web. There are a lot of ways to learn about this. But TDD, ATDD, and BDD are all there, and make sure to reach out and find out more about those. Techniques, there are lots of techniques. I've talked about inside out and outside in. And I'm also going to be talking about this idea that Ward Cunningham and Kent Beck and some of those folks had back in the late 90s, early 2000s with extreme programming, that when you get in programming to a point where you don't know how to move forward, asking yourself, based on what I know today, what's the simplest thing that could possibly work? So I have an article that talks about that as one of 5 tips to making test cases more simple. That's coming out in Tech Beacon next week or the week after, so look at techbeacon.com. But you know, there are lots of techniques for how to do this, and just be aware that you're not alone in this. I do see a couple questions, so I'm going to stop for just a second and take a couple questions, and then we're going to get back into this. So, okay, so Sean said, and feel free to jump in here with yours. So I'll just take a break for questions. Make sure to type them out. You can raise your hand, and I will find you, and we'll take you off of mute, and you can share over the phone. There's about 35 people on this call today, so it's a smaller group than we've had recently. I love the fact that every one of you is here. It's perfectly fine to have a small group every once in a while. And with it being so close to the end of summer, I know that plenty of people are finding better things to do with their time than being in an office or learning things about work. So Sean says, thinking visual testing first concept, how I think of it, which would allow develop less and faster. Your thoughts? Sean, if you could, I don't know if you'd mind coming off a mute and talking to me about this. I'm going to try to take you off of mute and see how this works. If you're not comfortable with that, just let me know, but I'm going to take you off of mute here for just a second, if I can figure out how to do it. Unmute Sean. Sean, are you there?
I am.
Hey, Sean, would you mind clarifying your question?
Okay. So this is the idea I have, is doing visual testing first and thinking of it first before we do more functional testing. And this way you have more checkpoints. They're easier to write. And using those tools like Appia tools to do that with, you can test not only the actual one-for-one screenshot, but also maybe just a layout if that's all you need. And that way, you're doing a lot more, there's a lot more assertion of that going on than you can possibly write. And so maybe in thinking of automation in terms of, let's do visual first, and then if we need to verify data, we can potentially do that through diving into the DOM and picking that out.
Nice. So it sounds like you've had positive experiences with visual testing, and by that I think when you talk about Appia and some of the other tools that are out there, I think what you're talking about is basically there are these tools, for those who don't know, and bear with me here, Sean, but for those who don't know, there are tools out there who can basically look at a screen and determine whether or not it's right. In other words, it takes an image that it's saved in the past of a particular web page, for instance, or native application in Windows or something like that. It takes that image and compares it to another image, or it may take sections of the screen or pieces of the app. Is that what you're talking about by visual testing, Sean?
Yes.
Perfect.
It's not just the screenshot itself, but it's also maybe just a div of the screen.
Yeah.
So you can small pieces if necessary.
Perfect. So, and you've seen benefits with doing that early on, because it sounds like because you didn't have to know every single detail on the screen and code it explicitly. Is that part of the benefit you see there?
Yes.
Okay, gotcha. Yeah, so I'm going to take you, thanks so much for that, Sean. I'm going to take you, put you back on mute. So, I love these comments. I love it when people jump in here and have their thoughts about this. I think that there are so many different approaches to test automation that's just very helpful to have them. I think that what Sean's saying here is one that I hadn't really thought of, and I haven't done a lot of visual testing like he's talking about. I haven't used Appia, although I've heard it's a terrific tool, and if you guys know anybody there, I would love to have them come out. I'm working on, as a side note, I'm working on the TISCA conference here in Chapel Hill, North Carolina, and we're looking for vendors like tool vendors and that type of thing, so contact me, Sean, or others if you know folks from Appia who might want to show off their wares at a conference of about 300 testers here in the Carolinas, the biggest one of its kind. So I don't know. I have nothing to gain from talking about specific tools. Nothing that I know of. I have no biases that are because I don't get paid. I'm trying to say I don't get paid or endorse any of these tools. I have heard good things about Appia, or Apply Tools, I think, is one of them. So anyway, that's a good idea. And so anything that we can do to kind of simplify the process, I think, is helpful. So when we can take the scope of the problem down and do less steps to get to the work that we're after, I think that that's helpful. And the earlier we can do that, the more information we can gain about the product, and the more information we can gain in frequent steps over time. So I think that that's kind of where Sean was going with that. That's where I'm going with a lot of this as well. TDD, aid TDD, these are techniques that work whether you use a certain tool, one tool or another. So it sounds like visual testing can be helpful as well. So implement a process. So this is kind of the way that I see iterative development working. Most agile methodologies have some type of iteration, whether it's a sprint or an iteration or something else. And during that time, all three of these activities can be going on: development, automation, and testing. So often I think we see these sequentially and as depending on one another, and they don't have to. They absolutely do not have to. We can break those dependencies by how we do the work. We can use practices to break dependencies in process, just like we could break dependencies in code. I'm going to get into that a little bit more, but I want to talk about the roles that I see involved in making this process faster, in developing software faster, and doing it at high quality, and getting ourselves as testers out of the way. One of the things that I didn't mention earlier is, to me, it doesn't really matter if there's actually a problem or a bottleneck with testing, or if it's just perceived that there's a bottleneck with testing. The behaviors that people have are based on their perceptions. So executives, leaders, managers, whoever they are in our organization, if they perceive us as being a bottleneck, we may as well be. So let's talk about that, and let's figure out how we change that perception. Let's behave in a way that breaks the bottleneck in order to change their perspective. And if we're not willing to talk about it and do something about their perspective and realize that there's no way we'll ever change. We have to realize the reality on the ground before we're able to change where we're going. So identifying roles, let's talk about this as a part of process. So we have a leader, a developer, a tester. I love to have a triage person with test automation and then a test automation engineer. Some of these might be new. We hear about leader. That doesn't necessarily have to be a manager. It doesn't necessarily have to be your Scrum manager, your project manager, or Scrum master, whatever it is. That could be a champion on the team that's just is very good at getting people moving in a certain direction. Many times the leader on the team is not the same as the manager. A developer, this is the person who's writing the code, the traditional kind of definition there. I don't think I'm breaking any ideas with that. Tester, this is the person who's designing tests and following these practices. Many times with what I'm going to show you, the tester becomes more of a consultant. They become more of an advisor with regard to testing and the practice of creating a high quality piece of code. Triage. So test automation. Many times you're going to have a build that's running in continuous integration. Hopefully you do. When your build is running in test automation or in continuous integration and you see failures, who is the person that's going to jump in and try to figure out what's going on there? Different teams have different ways of doing this. Many times it's helpful to have a person who's on triage. It's helpful to name someone, say you're on triage for this sprint. You're the person who's going to make sure every time something breaks, we figure out where the problem is and hand it off. Especially in the beginning part of creating test automation where we're learning how to write good test automation that doesn't break all the time because of the framework or because of the code related to your test automation. We've got to decide when that stuff happens, when there are problems with tests, when tests say that they're failing, we've got to decide, is it failing because of the system under test and a problem there? Is it failing because of the infrastructure? Is it failing because of the code that we wrote? Is it failing because the expectations we had are different from reality? Is it because our expectations were wrong? All of these things are the things that we have to talk through, and having people who are dedicated to that with test automation can be very helpful. I would not want to take away a developer's responsibility for ensuring that their unit tests were working properly. If you're a developer, you write the unit tests for your code, you check it and they break, nobody else's responsibility but yours, in my opinion, in my humble opinion. That's the way that works. You wrote it, you broke it, you bought it. And I like that approach with other things as well. It can work very well with other types of test automation. When we're doing test automation at the UI level, at the services level, that can help as well. And then you have the test automation engineer, and this is the person writing glue code. This is the person implementing the test and making sure that we actually verify something. So how does this work? How does this work? You know, I realized a long time ago there are how people and there are why people, and I've always been a why person. And I've tried to learn recently more about being a how person because there's value in each. We all have different ways of being and they're all valuable, and if we use them together it can be very helpful as long as we're aware of that. So a how person and how things. So how do we do this? So within one iteration here on the left I kind of proposed, it almost looks like a happy face now that I look at it, but within a particular iteration we're doing development, we're doing testing, we're doing automation, but how do we do that? So you can think of this in these three phases, and they are not all equal in terms of the amount of time that we use them, but that looked better for the slide. So planning. During planning, we're defining the interface and we're finding assumptions. And what I mean by those two things is we're in a planning meeting for a sprint, and we're talking through the user stories that have come in, the tasks that we need to create in order to implement that user story. There are going to be assumptions that everyone in the room is making. Assumptions about the word choice that's used within a story, assumptions about which user we're talking about, assumptions about implementations, assumptions about how we interact with existing code, all kinds of assumptions. So one thing that testers are very good at is uncovering those assumptions and talking about those assumptions. Developers can be very good at this too. Testers do this all day long, I believe. So there's a great place for testers to be involved. And for us to getting back to that peer-to-peer conversation is in these planning meetings. How do we have our testers and developers finding these assumptions, finding the gaps, and filling them prior to construction, prior to actually doing any work? I talk about define the interface here. I'm not just talking about a user interface, but one part of test automation is ensuring that we can get it going as early as possible. And in order for that to happen early in the process, we have to have some type of rule set to adhere to. So one of the processes that I see working very well, or one of the activities that I see working very well, is when developers and test automation engineers in advance talk about how we're going to automate our testing for the code. And inevitably, this leads to, look, if you're going to write the test automation first, you have to know certain things. That if you're going to test this user interface, the IDs are going to be X, Y, and Z. If we're going to test at a lower level white box testing directly with the code, here's an interface like a Java interface or an interface within C# or protocol in Objective-C. This is the interface that we're going to code to. And if the developer and the test automation engineer both agree to that, the test automation engineer can go away with that interface that's written before anybody else does anything and plug in a fake implementation of what the developer is going to write. And once that fake implementation is there, we can go through and write all the test automation we want. Once the developer is done, we plug that in where that interface was, where the fake implementation was. We can throw away the fake implementation and start testing the product right away. So we would have created the automation, we would have been able to write test cases while that's going along and write the code all at the same time because we were willing to define a few things up front, like the interface to which we're testing. Construction, this is another part of this. So while we're going through and developing the software, while we're coding, we're writing test cases, we're automating that. I just talked a little bit about that. And there tends to be this resolution state. There tends to be the state where we're integrating our work. We've gone and we've now taken, I talked about it very quickly here, but we've taken that fake code away, we put in the real code, and we started seeing, oh look, that interface isn't as well defined as we thought. You made assumptions about it over here, I made these, they're related to requirements, let's resolve those in order to get the software working as we want it to work. There's exploration that goes on at this point, so we've got something there. A tester can do a behavior that it has been common to them in the past, they can start exploring, but they didn't have to wait. They didn't have to wait for that to happen to add value to the process. A tester can be adding value to the process with creating test cases during the construction phase, with finding assumptions and defining the interface early on. We've got this evaluation that goes on, and then we've got deployment. Don't forget deployments. In agile environments and agile methodologies, most of them want to deploy something that's working at the end of each sprint. It doesn't have to go out to production, but it's deployable, it's producible, it's something that we could release if we wanted to. I've got each of these kind of overlapping for a reason, and that's because the lines between them are much more blurred than what I'm making out here. This is kind of a continuum of what's going on. And you may have this happening with multiple tasks throughout the iteration. It does not have to be as sequential as this. The resolution may happen during construction or earlier on, and some of those pieces may happen earlier than others. But we tend to do some type of planning for these iterations. If you're in a traditional environment, you may see this as being very sequential, and that's perfectly fine as well. The same type techniques can work here. So let me move on here. Simplify how we begin. This is one of the things that I get asked a lot is how do we start out with test automation? And these are the things that I like to keep in mind with test automation. We want to have few people involved when we're getting started, when we're first starting test automation, and that just keeps things simple. We want the simplest test that we can possibly do. Let's start with the silliest test and start with that. Most people want to say, where's the bang for the buck with test automation? It's because we're going to save time, so let's take the most timely test cases and let's do those first. The problem with that is, most of the time, the people who are doing this test automation have no experience doing test automation before, or they don't have experience with this tool, or they don't have experience with this application. So we're making the problem more complex to start out with. Let's not take the most complicated, longest test case. Let's take the simplest ones. Let's automate those first, and let's build on what we learned there and produce something early and often. Executives, managers like to see this as well because they want to see the payoff as early as possible. The earlier you can put something in front of someone that's working, that you can show them working, the better off you're going to be with test automation. Make sure that these things are repeatable, have them working in different environments. We want to make sure that we make variants of our test cases and test scripts, change the inputs, change the verifications. we want to lessen the pressure and urgency with regard to test automation. If you have a new developer, and most of the time new test automation engineers are new developers, a new developer, the worst thing you can do is say, I need you to write this code by Wednesday. That's just the worst thing you can do. Pressure like that works in other situations. Pressure works for building muscles. Pressure works for becoming more productive in some cases with things that are just mechanical. When you limit resources for a mechanism or a system, the system has to become more efficient and effective in order to survive. But with developing intellectual property, it's different. If you had two people taking a calculus test, and you gave them one of them 15 minutes and the other an hour, which do you think is going to do better? It's the person that has more time is probably going to be better able to deal with the problem that's there and understanding the math and everything that's going on in that test. This is the same type of thing when we're coding. When we're writing test automation, we are coding. We are doing a development activity when we're doing that. So run tests in parallel, ordered and disordered. I like this because it uncovers dependencies, it uncovers problems that we didn't necessarily know were there. So in the end, there are three pieces to this. Number one, we know there's a bottleneck, let's break it. Let's break the bottleneck by doing things like using test automation, by doing things like making sure that we have a nice nurturing environment for test automation, making sure that we prioritize testing, that we make testing a first-class citizen, not just the individual contributors. One piece of that I didn't really talk about is making sure that testing within your organization is an activity that's valued. If we don't value testing within your org, you're not going to get test automation to work. It's just not, because you're going to do the same thing with test automation that you did with testing. If you don't value testing, you throw it away, you push it away, you take people off of it, you don't put time into it. Putting it in code is not going to fix that problem. No tool is going to fix that problem. You have to fix the problem with the priorities in the organization first. And I see that repeatedly within organizations. So use test automation and then accelerate. We can accelerate using test automation if we have the right guidance, if we have the right direction, if we have the right principles in place. So we're coming to an end here. I have references. These are some of the ones that I mentioned. I'm always happy to share these slides. Please reach out to me, paul@beaufortfairmont.com, for these slides or for the references. Ask me about office hours. It's something that I'm doing lately, a paid service for your teams to be able to get experience, to get some coaching with regard to test automation. My webinars, you've probably found them by now, beaufortfairmont.com/webinars. I like to blog out on beaufortfairmont.com/blog. Find me on Twitter, email me. Here's my number. I want to talk with you. I want to get to know you. I want to know what your problems are. If we can sit down and spend 30 minutes or an hour chatting through what's going on and I can help you, that's terrific. If we find during that hour that there's more that we could do together that makes sense for you, then let's do that and let's discuss that further. But I'm always open to sitting down and talking through these challenges for 30 minutes or an hour. I like to get to know people on these webinars, so I'll probably be reaching out to you. If you're new to these things, I'd like to reach out to you and get to know you better. Feel free to reach out to me as well. I want to hear what's going on with you. I want to take a break here and just ask what questions you guys have. I'd like to know what your thoughts are on accelerating the delivery of software with higher quality through test automation. Is that something you've seen happen? What are the problems that you've seen happen? We have about 12 minutes left in the time that we've allotted here, and so I've ended up a little bit early. What do you want to talk about with regard to this? What questions do you have with this particular presentation? You can either raise your hand or type in a question, and I will try to find them and walk through them. Yeah, so here's a question by Danielle, and Danielle asks, do you think it's possible for a manual tester to begin test automation being the only tester with limited resources? So, so this is a really good question, being the only tester. So I see this a lot, and I've talked about this in many of these conversations. I've talked about it in a lot of my writing. I see this again and again. Lots of organizations that I go into, they start out by having one champion of test automation, and many times what these teams and groups do is they take the tester that's currently on the team. So for instance, maybe they'll have 5 developers and 1 tester. They say, I know how we can make this go faster. Let's use the tester as our test automation engineer. They seem interested in it, and let's have them do that. Well, there's several things that go on with this. Number one, any transition between a tester moving from doing hands-on testing over to doing test automation generally involves learning a lot of skills. There are a lot of learning curves to go up. There's a learning curve of the tool you're using, the programming language you're using, and most of the time what I see is that the requirements and the activities that the tester had prior to doing test automation don't change. They don't change. We still expect the same things. And we also expect to be able to shift back and forth between test automation and those activities. So if the tester needs to do 2 weeks solid of regression testing, they don't do test automation during that time. The other thing that I see is that the investment in this is way too low on most teams. I've seen lots and lots of times where this person that's going to do test automation, I sit down with the team and I say, well, tell me about how much test automation you're doing. They say, well, we're doing this for 3 hours a week or 5 hours a week or something like that. I said, well, that's not going to get it done, folks. It's just not. Like, you can't do that. This is a full-time development activity. My last one of these webinars was about making the case for full-time test automation engineers, and that's available out on this webinars link here. Watch that. It's not reasonable to ask someone to learn to code in 5 hours a week. It's just not. It took me probably 2 years into my career after getting a computer science degree to start feeling like I was proficient in what I was doing. I was actually probably proficient in it 10 years into my career. That's when I could really start kind of knocking some things out. But if you're only going at 5 hours a week, so in essence 1/8 of the time that a full-time person would have to learn how to code as a developer, it's going to take you 8 times as long to do that. So if it took me 2 years to feel proficient, it's going to take this person 16 years at 1 hour a day. And that's not something that most people want to wait for. So do I think it's possible? I think that's a great question. Do I think it's possible for a manual tester to begin test automation? Absolutely. As the only tester with limited resources, that makes it very difficult. This is a full-time job. People believe that the barrier to entry for test automation is much lower than it actually is. Check out that other one. Thanks for that other webinar. Thanks for your question, Danielle. Here's a question from John, and we still got plenty of time left here. I'm sorry I went on so long for that one. Here's one from John. Some of the issues I've had has been in finding good, reliable service level testing tools. Besides Ready API, what other service testing tools would you recommend? So I just saw a really great presentation by Evil Tester, Alan Richardson, out on LinkedIn. It's on YouTube. But if you look up Alan Richardson and Rust API, that's a pretty cool tool. He does a great job of walking through that. You know, it doesn't take much to test an API. It does not take much to test an API. You can make a curl command from the command line. You can hit it through a browser. You can hit an API, and you're talking about service level testing. So I'll take a step back on that as well. But assuming we're talking about APIs and RESTful APIs that are through HTTP, there are lots of ways to do that. You can write 5 lines of code. You can go grab those lines off of Stack Overflow to make a call to a URL, and then you can use a JUnit or a InUnit or whatever it is to test whether or not you got back what you thought you were going to get back. There are lots of great tools out there. Tools are not usually the problem. The problem is commitment. The problem is willingness to do these things. The problems are skill sets. The problems are how much are we willing to invest in new skill sets and in gaining new skill sets to do these things. And do the people that we're asking to gain the skill sets actually want to do them? I think there's a big problem out there right now with testers where every job description is asking for test automation, and very few testers are actually doing a lot of hands-on test automation. And they want to in order to keep getting jobs and to keep the job they have, not because of internal factors a lot of the time. So I'm happy to clarify that a little bit more later. But John, I just what had a hard time finding tools. There are lots of good tools out there. I don't know them all. I know SOAP UI is one of the ones that's out there. There are a lot of good tools out there. You've got things like Postman, which is a great way to test tools. There are just so many tools for doing API testing. Service level testing can mean something different. Usually if you're calling directly into the code with these types of things, you're going to need to be writing code. You're going to need some type of unit test or assertion-based library to do that. Hopefully I answered that for you. We talked to, someone here is asking about information about ROI and test automation. I can't really get into all of that in the next 5 minutes. I can point you to an article out on TechBeacon that I wrote. So if you look me up, Paul Merrill on TechBeacon, you'll see I've written a few articles there. One of them was 5 of the ways that ROI can be calculated with test automation. The one that most people will look at is how much time did the test automation save. So you can look at how long it takes to run the script, how often we run the script, multiply out the number of times that we've run it by the amount of time it took to run it, and then compare that to the amount of time it took to do that manually and how many times we were doing this manually. And that gives you a nice little ROI there, and you can look up the ROI formula out there. But that's the basic one that I use most of the time to talk about ROI, but there are many other types of returns that we get from test automation. So here's another question from Tom, and I hope that answers your question, Zishan. Does it matter if test automation is done using an open source or commercial tool in terms of it having a better chance of being effective in getting non-developer type testers to do test automation? I think that's a great question. I think that's a terrific question. I do not see test automation succeeding when test engineers do not have programming skills. I'll say it that way. I think I've said this the wrong way a lot of times, and I'm trying to say this more accurately now. There are so many factors involved in who adopts which tools. I think that if we have a team of testers who has no experience with test automation and who are used to GUI type tools, asking them to code is going to be very foreign. I find this a lot of times. Trying to train an entire team of traditionally manual or hands-on testers to do test automation or programming, it just doesn't work a lot of the time without a huge amount of investment. And in fact, the only places where I've seen it work, the success rate I would say was about 30%, meaning 30% of the testers who wanted to convert over, who initially tried to convert over to test automation actually did over a period of time. And even in those cases where 30% of the people transferred over and were able to do it, I would say that that only 2 out of 3 of those continued to do it for any significant amount of time and were able to produce good test automation, not great test automation, but good test automation. So I'm not saying that it can't be done. Absolutely, it can be done. You can change, you can learn these skills. But I got to tell you, a lot of times people are in testing because they were able to see what programming was to begin with. They saw it in college, they decided they didn't like it or didn't want to do it, and they decided at that point not to pursue it. So why do we expect them to pursue it now when they're 10 or 20 years into their career? The UI portion of this, some people are more comfortable with the GUI stuff, some people are not. But once again, my experience has been that successful test automation comes from programming skills, from having full-time test automation engineers who have those skills and who have supported the whole team and the right underlying kind of nutrition and nurturing to make that happen. We're coming to the end of our time here. I want to thank everybody for their questions, for their comments, for sharing their time with me. Everybody who decides to spend an hour with me on these webinars, I just appreciate the heck out of it. I hope you've gotten a lot out of this. I need ideas for the next ones of these, for the next few webinars. So send me your ideas either through Twitter or through email, paul@beaufortfairmont.com. Reach out to me however you need to. If you're on a Slack channel with me or something like that, ping me that way. I'd love to hear what your thoughts are and what your ideas are about what to do next. I know that the API one that I did recently was very well received, and maybe there's something more that I can do with that. But I need your ideas. I want to hear what you want to talk about and what you want to learn about. So hit me up with those. Once again, reach out to me. Let's spend some time chatting together and getting to know what your challenges are. If I can help you in a short conversation, I want to. Okay? Thank you so much for being here, and I'll see you all next month. Thanks.